So welcome our students and our audience. I'm just going to wait a little bit longer. We have got students from the Tshwane University of Technology that are joining us. They are our primary audience. And this is a series all about zoonotic diseases. And our students are second year natural resource management students. And this is the second in our series. And it is a talk, as you can see, about avian influenza. So I'm going to go ahead and begin introducing our speaker, Robert Bragg, Professor Robert Bragg. Yes, so Professor Robert Bragg is an esteemed researcher and lecturer at the University of the Free State in South Africa. His research interests include diseases in fish, various poultry diseases, and infectious coryza. And I'm going to leave that word up to him to describe its definition for you. Vaccine development, and the link between antibiotic and disinfectant resistance. Robert has been actively involved in addressing the avian flu outbreaks in South Africa, providing insights into the impact on poultry supplies and the measures needed to control the spread of the virus. Now, until recently, when I began reading about avian flu, I was still under the impression that it was pretty much a disease that affected domestic poultry. I had no idea of its origins and the extent of its present and potential impact to wild animals and to humankind. Robert, it is an absolute pleasure to have you here with us to share your knowledge and expertise. I've had the advantage of a sneak preview of your slideshow, and I really look forward to your talk this evening. The floor is yours.
No, well, thank you very much. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be here and to be able to talk a bit. You wanted an answer on the infectious coryza. Well, that is basically like a sinus infection in chickens. So when they get the sinus infection, it's in layer birds, then they stop laying eggs, and then you don't have nice bacon and eggs for breakfast. All right, so let's go right into it. We're going to be talking about avian influenza as important zoonotic diseases. So what I'm going to be covering, because I understand the key audience is a second year natural resources sciences. So I could make the talk extremely complex, but that wouldn't get us anywhere. So I've kept it hopefully relatively understandable. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to just briefly look at what are microorganisms, what are pathogens, because these are important terms that we're going to be speaking about. What is a zoonosis? And then look at some important zoonotic diseases. And then we'll start talking about influenza and then avian influenza, and then why this is such a major problem. Okay, so what are microorganisms? So we've got basically three main classes of microorganisms. The first one is of fungi. And yeah, you can see some examples. This is a bread mold. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but you all know a piece of bread, if you leave it out, you get mold on it. And the photo above is a yeast under a scanning electron microscope. So these are good examples of fungi. They are eukaryotic cells. So basically they have a nucleus, they have organelles, and the eukaryotic cell structure is basically the same cell structure that humans and all animals have as well. So the cell structure is fairly closely related or fairly similar to humans and animals. They tend to grow on dead material, and they produce spores, which can become quite problematic, particularly if you inhale these spores. So when you get large amounts of this bread mold and you inhale it, it can cause problems. And then we have yeast strains, which are becoming quite problematic in the medical field, because there's growing concerns around resistance to some of these yeast strains. They replicate without a host. Oops, I'm going a bit ahead of myself here. Just see, I can go back. They replicate quite quickly, and they are difficult to treat, primarily because they've got the same cell structure that we have. And they produce toxins, mycotoxins. You might have heard of mycotoxins. If you're storing mealies, for example, and you have fungi growing in it, it develops these toxins, which can be quite damaging to people. But they're also quite good for us because they make beer, wine, and bread. So they're not all bad. Then bacteria. So bacteria are quite important pathogens, and they what's commonly called prokaryotes. So they don't have nuclei, they don't have internal cellular structures. The genome is a circular DNA inside the bacteria. They're single-celled, and they replicate independently, and they are free living, and they can be pretty much found everywhere. In fact, in your body, it's estimated that there's actually more bacterial cells in your body than there are human cells. So you're actually a walking zoo of microorganisms. They replicate very quickly. On average, they replicate by splitting in two, and it takes them 20 minutes to do this. So if you start with one bacterium, in 8 hours, you've got 1 million. In 20 minutes, you've got 2 million. And 20 minutes later, you've got 4 million because they're splitting in two. And fortunately, some of the bacteria that cause diseases are what's known as opportunistic pathogens. And I'll explain that term a little bit later. And then we get to viruses. And avian influenza is obviously a virus. And so we spend a bit of time on the viruses. So they are very, very, very small, nanometer sizes. So you can only see viruses under an electron microscope. They're neither prokaryotic or eukaryotic. And there's some debate around whether they're living or not, because they're basically just genetic material with a protein shell. But the definition of life is they have to be able to replicate, and they have to have evolutionary line. In other words, they can mutate. And I think with COVID, everybody heard about the SARS-CoV-2 strain that was mutating throughout the infection. So viruses can replicate, they can mutate, so they're living. The important thing about viruses, they cannot replicate without a host. So if you have a human virus or a chicken virus or a plant virus, it can only replicate inside that host. Fortunately, animal viruses, including human viruses, replicate very, very slowly. So that gives our immune system time to actually compete with the viruses. But some of them can be extremely stable in the environment. They can last for up to 6 months in the environment. And they are mostly what we call primary pathogens. So every now and again, when I'm changing subjects, I've put an odd photograph in for you. I'm a certified wildlife photographer, and so I've got some nice photos. This is a photo I did quite well with in a competition. I called this photo the kiss, because it just looks like the one is kissing the other one. So yeah, every now and again we'll have some nice photos to keep you a little bit entertained. So what are pathogens? So pathogens are the microorganisms that cause disease. Fortunately, there's not a lot of them, but they are still the biggest killer of mankind. Microorganisms have killed more people than all the wars, all the floods, all the disasters, all the murders, anything you care to name, all the wars. Microorganisms have killed way more people. Viruses, bacteria, and fungi and yeast can all become pathogenic. So they cause, the pathogens are the microorganisms that cause damage. So when we're talking about a primary pathogen, this is a pathogen that'll cause a disease when you come into contact with it. And most of the viruses are regarded as primary pathogens. The opportunistic pathogens are the organisms that you find living associated with yourself, and they cause problems when you're under stress. They can then start causing problems, and so when you're under stress, they kick in and they start causing some problems in your body. But like I say, most of the organisms are non-pathogenic. This looks like another photo break. This is two young male lions. You can see they're male. They're just starting to get a bit of, starting to get a bit of a mane, and they just had a feed, and they were playing with each other, and they look like two boxes that are connecting. So my timing on this photo was really good. And there's some springbok. This was in the Khalkhadi. And there's another little ground squirrel. And this is hyena with a cub. All right, so what are zoonosis or zoonotic diseases? So this is an illustration just where you get a good idea. You've got animals, you've got people, and you've got the microorganisms. And this is the microorganisms spreading from the animals to the person. So the zoonosis is a disease that is normally found in animals, but which can spread to man. I mentioned viruses are extremely host specific. So generally when a virus crosses the species barrier, when it jumps the species barrier, it becomes a serious pathogen. And I've put the photo is of a bat, because a large number of the zoonotic diseases appear to come from bats. The bats, there's some really serious diseases that have come in from bats. All right, so zoonoses such as COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 are diseases that are transmitted from animals to humans. So it's estimated approximately 75% of the new emerging infectious diseases come from animals. And 60% of infectious diseases in humans are spread from animals. And they cause billions of cases of infection in a year or in the population. And it's estimated that 2.7 million people die. So you can get some indication of the significance and importance of zoonotic diseases. So where do they come from? There's a number of options. Live animal markets. We all know SARS. The SARS I'm talking about here is not the South African Revenue Service. Once you start working, you'll hate the word SARS because they come and take all your money. This was severe acute respiratory syndrome. This was the first COVID outbreak that we had. And then COVID-19 was the second one. And live markets is a very good place for avian influenza. And then intensive wildlife farming, again, COVID-19, rabies, and then avian influenza can come out. Domestic animals, Hendra virus, Nipah virus, avian influenza again, and then wildlife hunting, but this is more consumption of bush meat. So it's using it's catching the animals and using them for food. And the two main ones in this case would be HIV, which is believed to have come from chimpanzees, and then Ebola, which came from eating bats. Yeah, so they could all of these activities can lead to infections in humans, which can be very significant. It's another photo. This is a brown bear I took in Alaska. He was playing with a stick he picked up in a river. All right, so some important zoonotic diseases. This is the table of the all-time hit parade of killers. So you can see the top one is Black Death or bubonic plague. This was a disease that killed about 1 in 4 people in Europe in the late 1800s. It's a disease that's transmitted by fleas that are carried on rats. So this is a perfect example of a zoonotic disease, and this is the top killer. Then we have smallpox. So smallpox is also up there as a major killer. Now, smallpox has effectively been eradicated. So smallpox is man's biggest success story. It was the first disease for which a vaccine was developed in the 1700s, and it was absolutely controlled through vaccination, and there are no more cases of smallpox in the world today. And then we have the Spanish flu, or the 1918 flu pandemic. And then you'll see there's a number of other plagues along the table here. These all need to go in along with the Black Death, because this is all caused by Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague. So if you add all of these together, then the Black Death or the bubonic plague becomes by far the leading cause of death. And then we've got a couple of flu outbreaks: the Asian flu, Russian flu, Hong Kong flu. There was a Mexican flu outbreak as well. So what's interesting, of the 13 top diseases mentioned here, only 2 of them are not epizootic diseases, or not diseases that come from animals. That is smallpox, which has been eradicated, and then cholera, which we have as a problem in contaminated drinking water. The others are all zoonotic diseases. So this gives you an indication of the severity of, or the risks associated with zoonotic diseases. Couple of other ones that aren't on the list: Ebola. So the image top right, this is what the virus looks like, and then the bringing out the people that have died. Once the person has died from Ebola, they are at their most infectious. So most transmitted cases of Ebola were associated with funerals. So there's a very, very big problem handling and removing the dead people in Ebola cases. And then anthrax. This is Bacillus anthracis, spore-forming bacteria. This is a common disease in wildlife. In fact, the Kruger National Park often has big problems with anthrax. The animals get it and they die. And then the vultures come along and they eat the carcasses, and the vultures don't get sick from the Bacillus anthrax. And then they go along to the water holes, they drink some water, they put the spores and the bacteria around the water holes, and the animals come and they drink and they get anthrax and they die. And rabies, so there's two photos of rabies. And if you're doing any work with rabies, it's very, very important that you get vaccinated against rabies, because it is a serious disease. If a rabid animal bites you and you don't get treatment, you die an extremely painful death. And if you're working with animals, handling animals, vaccination, you should get yourself vaccinated. This looks like more photos. My tigers. These are all my photos, guys. These aren't stolen off the internet. So some nice little tigers. And the tigers become quite relevant because just last week they were talking about, in Thailand, they had to put down a number of tigers in the zoo in Bangkok, because the tigers had picked up avian influenza. So it's the tiger photos are very relevant to the topic. Okay, so what is flu? So most of you have had flu. So it's a well-known human disease. You can have high fever, muscle aches, sore throat, headaches, coughing. Every year people get seasonal flu. So this is caused by the same virus, the influenza virus, but this is the human version of influenza. So if you look at the viruses, there's just some illustrations. This is an electron micrograph. So this is very high resolution electron microscope photos of the virus. And what's important with influenza are these protrusions on the surfaces. So we've got, yeah, you can see them. There's proteins on the surface. One's called hemagglutinin, and the other one is called neuraminidase. So when we're talking about influenza, we normally talk about influenza H1N1 or H5N3. So that means if it's H1N1, this is the type 1 hemagglutinin, type 1 neuraminidase. Yeah, another tiger pops up, like the tigers. And some more tigers. They love playing in water. It's very nice seeing these tigers being so playful. All right, so what is avian influenza? So avian influenza is flu in birds, and it's a big problem. The chickens get the disease, and it causes major problems. So avian influenza is the most serious disease in poultry. There's 100% mortality in unvaccinated flocks. So within 3 days, if you're a commercial chicken farmer, within 3 days, you can lose 60,000, 70,000 birds in 3 days. And this is what it looks like when there's avian influenza in the flocks. There's just literally dead birds everywhere. It is a control disease. So in many parts of the world, the policy is a stamping out policy. So when a flock is detected to have avian influenza, the birds are culled, and you try and literally stamp it out, prevent it from spreading. And you can see the people taking serious precautions when working with avian influenza, birds that have died from avian influenza. So this is a map that it shows the recent outbreak. If you were watching the news, there was a serious outbreak of avian influenza in South Africa. And this is a distribution map of where the cases were. So in South Africa, in the past, there was a stamping out policy. But once it got to this point, it was impossible to eradicate the infected flocks. So the government has allowed introduction of vaccines for the control of avian influenza. So that was a big step and a big fight to get the vaccination allowed, because in the past, like I said, it was stamping out. And if you vaccinate, then you can't monitor for influenza outbreaks. So the question was, is it better to have a system for monitoring, or is it better to protect the flocks? And the decision was, because it was so widespread now, that it would be better to protect the flocks. So this is how it generally works. So the bird influenza virus is H5N1, so that's hemagglutinin type 5 and neuraminidase type 1. So it comes from wild birds, gets into poultry, can go from poultry to man, they'll go from wild birds to cows, it can go from cows to poultry, it can go into cats, and then it all can go into humans. So there's been some scares in the USA at the moment. There are some people that have become infected with bird flu from cows. So every time the virus crosses the species barrier, it potentially becomes more dangerous. And I mentioned now the tigers in Thailand. So it got into the tigers in Thailand, didn't get to humans, fortunately. So we're waiting with bated breath to see how bad it's going to become if it's going to get into humans and cause another major pandemic. It has got into the wild birds in South Africa. There's problems with the penguins, the African penguin, the seabirds, the gannets, this looks like an albatross, pelicans, and then geese. So generally, avian influenza around the world is carried by migratory water birds. So as the birds migrate around the continent, they drop off their packages of avian influenza along the way, and then it gets into the commercial poultry. Ah, another tiger. They were very playful. Okay, so why is this disease regarded as a serious threat to mankind? So you can go from backyard flocks into chicken, into poultry farms. You can go from wild birds into the poultry farms, and then it can get across into the humans. And basically, once it develops human to human transmission, then it spreads very quickly and it can cause a very serious disease. This is just another illustration. The really big 1918 pandemic was involved. It was a bird virus that got into a pig, and then it got into a human, and that started the 1918 pandemic. So there's a system called antigenic shift. So if you look at the virus has got 8 different segments of genetic material. So what happens when the virus replicates? So if it's a bird virus and it replicates in the bird, when the virus assembles itself, it pulls these genes in and it stays a bird virus. But sometimes it can get into a human and sometimes it can get into a pig. And then we get what's called reassortment events. So the virus that comes out has got some bird genes, it's got some pig genes, it's got some human genes, and if it develops human to human transmission, we have a major mortality, we have a major pandemic on our hands. So this is an image of the 1918 flu pandemic. So this looks a bit reminiscent of some of the things we saw in COVID. This was called the Spanish flu. And 1918 was the end of the First World War. So this virus broke out. It's very well documented at this stage. There was a farmer in the USA who had a bird that had influenza, got into his pigs, and then he picked it up. And he was day or two before he was reporting for military training in the USA. So he went to the army camp with this nice little virus that he was carrying. He started infecting people in the army camp. Then they started shipping soldiers across to Europe to go and fight in the First World War. And most of the not most, it was about half of the soldiers on the boats died from influenza. And then it got into the Western Front and estimated killing between 50 and 100 million people died. So this was a serious pandemic. Just some photos of people wearing masks. So it wasn't so strange for us to wear masks in the COVID era. And I love this photo because the cats even got a mask on. So it was, people realized that it could spread to the cats and they were actually protecting their cats as well. So why don't we know if there were 50 million or 100 million people dying? Well, 1918 was the last year of the First World War, and they were pretty effective at killing each other. And they weren't really counting how many people died from flu or how many people were blown up or how many people died from wounds. So the people were dying, and were they shot, were they whatever. So my personal feeling is I think the influenza virus ended the First World War because both the Germans and the Allies were losing so many soldiers to the virus, they just couldn't carry on. So yeah, we have, again, goes through birds, seabirds, water birds, goes into chickens, can get into pig, gets into humans, and then we have a major pandemic developing. So the 1918 pandemic was H1N1, bird to human transmission. Then we had a H2N2 in 1957 that caused problems. The Hong Kong was H3N2. So this is the different spike proteins on the virus that goes through a reassortment event. We had a Mexican influenza outbreak, which was exactly the same virus as H1N1 that caused the Spanish flu. There were about 1 million people died in that outbreak. Why that virus didn't kill us all, nobody knows. Influenza virus is by far the most studied of the viruses. So now we're waiting for what the next pandemic is going to be. So probably going to be an avian virus that crosses with a human virus, and then we get some new strange variant coming out, and then we're all going to die. If you ask any virologist what virus you're really scared of, if they know what they're talking about, it'll be influenza virus, because it's a serious, once it gets going, it's a very, very serious virus. So this is another photo. This was before AI. This was a photo I spent hours making. The lake in the background is Lake Michigan in the US, and these mammoth skeletons were taken at the Museum of Natural History in New York. And then you cut them out and pluck them down and make it look like they're coming out of the water. Okay, so in conclusion, influenza virus remains a threat to world health. The virus can become a zoonotic disease and move from animals and birds to people. And once it gets into people, if it can spread easily amongst humans, we will end up with the next major pandemic. Now, epidemiologists reckon we're about 30 years overdue for a major influenza pandemic. So they study the outbreaks of influenza, and it's about every 40, 50 years, there's a major influenza pandemic. And we are overdue. So we're all waiting with bated breath for the next major pandemic. So you need to be very careful if you're working with animals, particularly dead animals. Just make sure you disinfect your hands and stuff like that. And then the last point is a little bit on global warming. So how can global warming impact us? So I've mentioned some of these deadly diseases: Spanish flu, bubonic plague or the Black Death, smallpox. Now, there's thousands of bodies in the northern hemisphere, particularly the colder parts of the northern hemisphere, that are buried in what's called the permafrost. So these bodies are basically in a deep freeze. And with global warming, the deep freeze is starting to melt. And so what's going to happen when these bodies thaw out? We could introduce all these deadly pathogens back into the world. In fact, there was a study done where they exhumed a body and they isolated the Spanish flu virus from a body that died in 1918 that had been in the ice. So as this ice melts, all these things can be released. And this is a pretty much intact frozen woolly mammoth. So all these animals that died thousands of years ago, what scary pathogens can these animals be carrying? So once they start defrosting, could they start releasing pathogens into the world that's going to kill us all? And then the other major problem with global warming is the range of many of the insects, like mosquitoes, is changing. So dengue fever was a virus that's transmitted through mosquitoes that only occurred in the tropics. Dengue fever is now in Mozambique. So it's coming closer and closer and closer to us. Yellow fever, also a disease only occurs in the tropics, is in Angola. Why is it changing? Global warming is changing the range of the mosquitoes. So unforeseen consequences of global warming. And one last parting shot. This is also a photo I made. The lightning I took at Mabula Game Reserve, and the T-Rex was a life-size T-Rex. Toys R Us in the USA, and it was amazing because this thing moved just like a real dinosaur. And I've got hundreds of photos of it in different poses. I've even got a herd of T-Rexes walking around the flowers in Springbok that I made. So it was great fun. But now AI does this for you in a click of a button. It took me days to make this photo. And that's it. Open for questions.
Thank you very much, Robert. Absolutely super presentation. I found it really fascinating, and I love how you punctuated it with your other passion for amazing wildlife photography. Really super. And your birds in the background didn't disrupt anything at all. It seems very fitting that you've got birds in your background. So so yeah, fantastic talk. A very great overview of the zoonotic diseases, and then a nice dip into avian influenza. So thank you very much for that.
It's a great pleasure.
Yes, I can see a comment from Wynand Goosen saying an excellent talk. And I'm going to start off with a question. And I
see
wanted to
there's a
ask
hand
you
up.
whether after the last major outbreak of influenza in South Africa, whether there's been any change in the control measures that are being taken.
So the avian influenza control in poultry was originally stamping out. If a flock if it was detected that it had influenza, the flock would be killed and disinfected, and in that way try to stop the spread. So we had avian influenza. So for many years, South Africa was just about the only major poultry producing country in the world that didn't have influenza problems, because primarily in the northern hemisphere in the USA, the during the migration of the water birds, they'd come down south from the Arctic, and then they'd land in dams and things close to the poultry farms, and the chickens would pick up the virus. So it's been a big problem in poultry around the world for many years. But South Africa was relatively free of it because we don't really have a lot of, well, we don't have any migratory water birds that come from the northern hemisphere. We have the swallows that migrate. We have some of the raptors that migrate quite a bit. But there's generally the water birds don't migrate, and the disease is primarily carried in the water birds. So it was feasible to do eradication. And then the first outbreak, it was about 4 years ago. They controlled it with eradication, and then the latest outbreak, it just got out of hand. So it was completely we lost control of it. So now veterinary services has allowed for vaccination of poultry with avian influenza. So now the birds are being vaccinated. So there has been a change.
I must say, Robert, your talk was very informative and fascinating, but at the same time, yeah, I learned a lot of disturbing, or at least there's quite a lot of disturbing scenarios that come to mind. So yeah, it's definitely very thought-provoking. I see that
Yes.
there's a hand raised by our director, Share Screen Africa director, Johan Kruger. Johan, welcome.
Hi, Robert. Thank you so much for the lecture.
That's a
I
pleasure.
first want to ask if we are 30 years overdue for a new influenza virus, why are we so lucky, in your opinion? And can we stretch our luck in any manner? And then thanks for the T-Rex. That's
That's a
love
pleasure.
that.
Love the T-Rex. Yeah. Look, it's like I said in the talk, the influenza's been brewing. It started about 20 years ago when it was time for us to have a pandemic, and then we had the Hong Kong bird flu problem, and they controlled it through killing all the birds. They literally killed all the birds in Hong Kong. So it's brewing. It's like, there's people now that have become infected in the US that picked up the virus from a dairy cow. So once it crosses the species barrier and it gets into mammals from a bird, and if it can then develop good human to human transmission, then it spreads easily, and we have a problem. The Spanish flu was exactly the same virus, H1N1, that caused the 1918 pandemic. And scientists pretty much think we know everything about the virus. We know exactly how it causes the disease, why it's pathogenic. So the Mexican virus was exactly the same as the 1918 virus. And the World Health Organization went from normal to maximum alert in one day. In fact, when I heard there was that the Spanish flu was H1N1, I went to my pharmacist and I said, "You give me Tamiflu now," because Tamiflu is a medication that works on influenza. So I've got my little stash of Tamiflu in the fridge. So when it happens, I might have my medication on hand. Why that virus didn't kill us all, we don't know. We really don't know. It just decided it's going to let us live a little bit longer. I know that's a terrible answer, but we don't know why we overdue. There's nothing we doing. It's the virus just is deciding it's not going to kill us just yet.
Thanks, Robert. Right. I just saw that there's a question in the chat from Gina Osaka, another colleague of mine. She says, "Hi, sir. Thank you so much for the talk. I heard you talking about Ebola. I would like to know more. I am from the DRC, and Ebola killed a lot of people indeed."
Yeah, so look, Ebola is a virus that spreads from bats into humans. So it's basically people eating bushmeat, and then they get it. Now, before it got into the big cities, all the virologists said, like, this virus is really, really bad, because when there was an Ebola outbreak in a village in the jungle, by the time people got there, everybody was dead. So everybody worked on the assumption that it has 100% mortality rate. Then it got into the big cities, and it was discovered that people are only infectious when they're showing clinical signs. So if you get infected, you can't infect other people until you're sick. So then it's feasible to do track and trace, to do quarantine, to do isolation, and that way they controlled it to a large extent. But it had a plus minus 60% mortality rate. So it remains a very, very serious, very nasty virus. What makes it such a nasty virus is it attacks the lining of the blood vessels. So the cells that it grows in is the lining of the blood vessels. So it destroys the lining of the blood vessels, and then you just bleed to death. And like I mentioned, the people are most infectious after they died. And traditional religious ceremonies, most of them have some sort of ritual around bathing the dead and clothing the dead and doing all sorts of things. So yeah, it's a really, really nasty virus. It's in that group of viruses, the Lassa virus family, and they've all got some seriously pathogenic viruses.
Thank you, Robert.
Is your hand
Dr.
up?
Silla Malanga, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
You muted. There we go.
Thank you so much. That was a very good presentation. I really enjoyed it.
I'm
Yeah,
glad.
and my question is, when you talked about the birds spreading the virus as they fly from one place to another, it got me wondering, like on the biosecurity measures, are there any biosecurity measures that work to this? And especially when the birds are in free range, like the chickens are in free, the poultry is in free range.
Look,
What can we do?
biosecurity can play a major role in preventing diseases in poultry. You got to make sure that you use a really good quality disinfectant. Fortunately, avian influenza is what's known as an enveloped virus, so it's not that difficult to kill. But yeah, you've got to have a good level of biosecurity on the poultry farm. And try and prevent prevent the virus from getting in. Once it's in, it spreads. If the birds are not vaccinated, 3 days, the whole flock is dead. But biosecurity can certainly help.
Okay, another question,
Okay.
a follow-up on that one. So you have said like disinfecting. For like how frequent are we like advised to disinfect? Because you can disinfect today and tomorrow the bird will fly over and it will drop some
Yep.
viruses and everything. Yeah, so
A lot of the disinfectants that are on the market are toxic to the birds. So you can't use the disinfectants on the birds, the chickens. There is a product that you can use in the drinking water and to spray the birds that's non-toxic. And that if that was used, that particular product was used extensively in South Africa on the avian influenza, because you could spray the birds, you can spray them sopping wet, you can spray them 5 times a day. It was safe to use on the birds. So it depends on what product you're using. Like a glutaldehyde based product, and that is very toxic. Most of the disinfectants are toxic to the bird.
okay. Can I ask a last one, a last question?
Sure.
Okay, like what's the prevalence of the avian influenza? If there have been some research in world birds, what is the prevalence like?
Look, there's out, we've had 2 major outbreaks of avian influenza in poultry in South Africa. Before, it wasn't really known in South Africa. South Africa, we've got a bigger problem with things like Newcastle disease. If you don't vaccinate the chickens for Newcastle disease, then you're going to have Newcastle problems. So Newcastle is endemic in South Africa. Avian influenza wasn't regarded as endemic until the second last outbreak, where it was established that it got into the wild bird population. So now the wild birds are potentially carrying the virus. The water birds generally don't die from avian influenza. They're carriers, so they're not. It's not as infectious and deadly in the wild birds as it is in the poultry. So the main epizootic aspects of it is commercial poultry farms. The people working on commercial poultry farms get exposed. The virus jumps from the chicken to the human, and then if it jumps into spreads from human to human, then we've got a problem.
Oh, thank you so much.
I hope that
Thank you,
helps.
Stella. Robert, I saw that photograph. I think it was of an Egyptian goose.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So I always imagine I see Egyptian geese everywhere.
Yep.
Are they not quite a major carrier?
Look, I think the exact carriers that are the problem in South Africa, there's a number of water birds that are potential carriers, but I think the fact now that the commercial poultry is going to be vaccinated, we'll be able to get it sort of reasonably under control.
Okay.
Because there was millions of birds that were lost in the last influenza outbreak. There was, luckily then the government allowed importation from Brazil, because there's always sort of the tariffs, and we don't want to import poultry from other countries because it's of job security and stuff. But they allowed now the importation of eggs and poultry meat from Brazil, because there was a shortage in South Africa. That we basically had severe problems with massive number of birds that died.
Yeah, and another little question of mine. You mentioned the African penguin
Mm-hmm.
as being also impacted. Was that quite a major die-off of the population or not? Because I know
No,
that they're very endangered.
no, they're very endangered. It was picked up in them, but I don't think there was massive mortalities associated with them.
Okay.
So luckily, because I mean those little penguins are really cute.
Yeah, they are. Okay. I'm just wondering whether we've got more questions from the floor. I don't see any hands that are raised. And if there aren't, then I think we're going to close the meeting, close the talk.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we'll do that. Robert, thank you so much.
It's a
It was
great
really an
pleasure.
excellent talk. Thank you. See
It's a
some hands
pleasure.
clapping for you. Thank you very much.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Good. Glad you enjoyed it. All right. Thank you,
Good evening,
everybody.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.